Geopolítica del caos.
Geopolitics of chaos. Iran, Venezuela, Greenland, Ukraine, Taiwan. The world seems engulfed in countless armed conflicts, all of them with the potential for even greater escalation, and in some cases, even the possibility of nuclear escalation. Are we walking the path toward a third nuclear world war? Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 321 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship. Joining us today are two top-tier analysts, truly first-class, extremely first-class, well-known to all of you. Two former DMP members, although perhaps not so former, because remember that DMP could eventually restart if you support us on our Patreon channel, specifically Mr. Santiago Martínez and Mr. Eduardo Vior. Santiago and Eduardo, hello, how's everything over there?
Vior, Santiago y Eduardo, hola, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
All good around here, though it's cold and rainy. We've been swimming for a week now and, well, temperature's around 10 degrees. You can definitely feel it.
Well, here we are not swimming, with a terrible drought in Buenos Aires and 31 degrees. A shower just fell, but one of those that only gets your fingertip wet and then moves on. We're melting.
Nos estamos derritiendo.
Qué buena ocasión esta para...
What a great opportunity for a three-way conversation on geopolitics. Germany, Berlin, Santiago, you in Galicia, if I remember correctly, and Eduardo in Buenos Aires, indeed. How about we start with the hottest issue at the moment, above all else? Yesterday, when all signs seemed to point toward a US military attack on Iran, US refueling planes in the air, monitoring aircraft like the AWACS, President Trump's order to withdraw non-essential military personnel from US bases in the Middle East, possible targets of an Iranian response in the event of an attack by the United States and Israel. Yesterday, as I was saying, statements and virtually all media outlets around the world were presenting the imminent attack as a fact. The closure of Iranian airspace and Iranian fighter jets in the air, awaiting an attack from the United States and Israel. In the end, the attack was not carried out, at least not yet.
Finalmente, el ataque no fue perpetrado. Aún estas escenas es de precisamente...
These scenes are precisely from this morning in the city of Tehran, the return of calm. The airspace once again appears to be open. Trump made statements yesterday, apparently immediate ones, with a de-escalatory tone, if I remember correctly, something along the lines of saying that the Iranians are abandoning the killings of people captured during the protests. However, let's remember that these back and forths, these sometimes escalatory, sometimes de-escalatory statements usually accompany attacks by the United States and Israel, creating confusion before the attack actually takes place. What analysis can and should we make of this situation in Iran? How imminent is an attack? Why? How might Iran respond? What are the chances of escalation? Wherever you'd like to start, whoever wants to begin, the floor is yours.
El micrófono cedido. Eduardo, tal vez?
Eduardo, maybe. Well, if they pass me the ball, go ahead. I think, Ezequiel Santiago, good afternoon, good evening to you in this first virtual meeting of the year. A year that's shaping up to be very eventful and with an imminent risk of war. I think we have to frame this in the broader context. First of all, the enormous weakness of the United States as a hegemonic power. Its transition from a global empire to territorial imperialism, to a national imperialism under Trump, which isn't really taking shape either because of the resistance of the international financial oligarchy itself.
La propia resistencia de la oligarquía financiera internacional. Entonces eso genera tensiones.
So that creates tensions. We can discuss it in the case of Greenland that are quite peculiar within NATO, and it generates an excessive sense of urgency on both sides in both factions of imperialism. First, to achieve some kind of result by the time the electoral campaign for the U.S. legislative elections officially begins next November. And second, to prevent the consolidation this year of all the financial and commercial mechanisms that have been implemented, both within the BRICS framework and through the countless connections across the Eurasian region.
Innumerables vínculos dentro de la región euroasiática. Entonces, la urgencia es mala consejera en política.
So urgency is a bad advisor in politics, and it makes one lose control and not think much about the consequences of what one is doing. That is, in principle, the explanation I give. The countless contradictory moves and bluster from President Trump, who later takes back his words, who threatens Venezuela, and then yesterday says that Delcy Rodriguez is a wonderful woman. The same with Iran. If they start shooting, we'll start shooting too. And yesterday I was told they're stopping the killing. Why did he say that? We need to reach an understanding. We need to reach an understanding with him. All of that shows that there's no planning, just reacting to crises, most of which are internal.
Crisis de las cuales la inmensa mayoría son internas. Sobre eso tenemos que volver después. Bien, ahora yendo a ir.
We'll have to come back to that later.
Concretamente.
All right, now moving on to the topic of Iran specifically. On one hand, as a result of 40 years of sanctions and blockade that have greatly limited the Islamic Republic's economic possibilities. But on the other hand, because of very misguided economic policies, the attempt to reconcile excessive privileges for exporters with the Republic's urgent need to obtain foreign currency at the expense of meeting the population's economic needs, which have already been under very, very, very heavy strain over the past decade. Let's remember, there have been real uprisings beyond outside intervention.
Ha habido alzamientos reales, más allá de la intervención. Se ha producido una devaluación gigantesca del.
A massive devaluation of the rial occurred at the end of December, which sparked a protest by the Tehran bazaar merchants. That protest was quickly resolved through negotiations with the Iranian government. However, almost immediately, other protests emerged, spontaneous in nature over the economic situation and hunger. But within just a few days, it spread, with impressive technical and military coordination throughout the western part of the country and even to some cities in the east.
Algunas ciudades del este. Y la demostración más palmaria de que hay una.
And the clearest proof that there is foreign interference behind the escalation of the protests is that, even though the Iranian government completely shut down internet services in some regions last week, small organized demonstrations continued to take place. They are no longer as massive as in the first days of the year, but they have been far more violent, with urban guerrilla-style actions, attacks on civilian targets, police killings, and so on. In other words, there has been a destabilization campaign. What has happened to make this situation you mentioned at the beginning occur? It's very simple.
Es muy simple. Es decir, Arabia Saudita.
That is to say, Saudi Arabia, which has its own problems, and we would have to talk about those as well, went directly to Washington and said, stop, because if you start a war now, you're not only going to destabilize the global economy, but you're also going to completely destabilize my kingdom, which has problems not only with Iran, with which it has never had a good relationship, but also with Yemen and very serious internal issues. The rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates has intensified in recent weeks, both geopolitically and militarily, and it could escalate militarily at any moment. So the Saudis asked for the planes to be grounded. For now, Trump has stopped them. We'll see what Netanyahu says, who so far doesn't seem to be taking part in the diplomatic maneuver.
Well, your analysis is very interesting. I completely agree with your contextualization. By the way, Eduardo Vior, your view on Iran, the imminence of an attack, the possible consequences, your overall analysis.
Well, I'd like to do as Eduardo did and start with a more global analysis, not just about Iran. But instead of focusing on the U.S. point of view and its role as a hegemon that wants to remain one, I'd like to look at the Russian perspective. And I say this because I see many comments from people in forums saying things like, it let Venezuela fall, it's going to let Iran fall, it let Syria fall. I analyze this and think that Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia doesn't have the military potential the Soviet Union had, nor, above all, the tremendous fleet the Soviet Union had. The fact is, we see that their own oil tankers are being attacked, and they don't have a fleet to travel in groups protected by military ships.
They
don't have that capability. So, Russia, for example, in Venezuela, what could it do? Some, of course, the more extreme ones, will say, send them nuclear missiles. Well, sure, that too. But if it acts that way by sending high-tech weapons, not nuclear anymore, but modern missiles and so on, it would be a direct confrontation between Russia and the United States. Considering that there are negotiations in Ukraine that Russia doesn't want to break off, it's not in its interest. Even if it's not interested in accepting peace, it's not interested in breaking off negotiations. So, people should really think about the fact that many see Russia as if it were Superman. No, it goes to Russia, launches an Oresnik, sends it to Venezuela, launches another Oresnik, and destroys Israel. Politics, geopolitics, doesn't work like that. Russia is fighting alone against 35 countries that have been sending weapons and mercenaries to Ukraine for 4 years. People think it's simple, but it's not easy, because a single country has to compete with the production of 35 NATO countries. Come on, that's an impressive achievement. And even so, it's still able to sell weapons to its partners, right? So I don't think much more can be demanded of it. I don't know what you all think, but I see that floating around and... Tell me, Eduardo.
I completely agree with you. What I would add regarding Iran, because yes, in the event of an American-Israeli attack on Iran, Russia and China would get very serious this time, is precisely what I was mentioning. In Iran, the communications and energy supply hub of Eurasia has been completed. That is, on one hand, Iran is the source of land-based gas and oil supply for China, which represents enormous security compared to shipments from the Persian Gulf, meaning maritime shipments. And on the other hand, Iran is China's route for projecting the Belt and Road Initiative toward the Mediterranean, at some point once the situation on the Mediterranean coast is defined. And on the other hand, it is the main hub for communication along the north-south corridor, which enables the transport of Russian oil to India through Iran. Thus, in Iran, the two main lines of communication for consolidating Eurasia's independence from Anglo-Saxon maritime power converge. In Iran lies the possibility for Eurasia to pursue a development project that does not depend on the seas, which has always been Eurasia's weakness compared to Europe. And for that reason, it is foreseeable that both China and Russia will not take it so calmly this time. At the same time, precisely what I am pointing out, and which has numerous banking, financial, and commercial implications, with new mechanisms and so on, is what drives the actions of the Anglo-Zionist powers to try to break the Iranian framework.
Going back to Iran, Eduardo explained everything perfectly. Simply put, if we look at the script of the event, it reminds us of Venezuela in 2018-2019 with Trump. Demonstrations, the guarimbas, because they are, I don't know what they call them in Iran, but it's the same thing, guarimbas in an Arab style. What? Guarimbas, sorry. So yes, the guarimbas, but with an Arab accent, right? Well, more like Persian, right? Undoubtedly, the secret services of Mossad and the United States, and surely the British too, as good lapdogs, are also involved in the game. They used all kinds of means, with their agents already infiltrated in Iran, to steer those demonstrations that are genuine, because in every country we protest and want pay raises, improvements. But these were demonstrations that were first provoked by a brutal blockade. That's what the United States always does. It blocks you economically, starves you, as happens with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Iran. And when it starves you, well, of course, normally people, the public, when they're struggling, they don't see Donald Trump. They see the one who governs their country. They hold him accountable, right? Some people are more understanding of the situation, others aren't, or they don't have the knowledge to be either, right? So it destroys the country. That's when the protests start. Then the protests, well, they get infiltrated, no doubt about it. And from there, well, it leads to an orange-style coup, right? An orange-style uprising. You have to see that. I had the data here. In Iran, there were reports of police beheadings, people burned alive, fires in public buildings, police stations, shops, homes. In some cities, up to 200 stores were burned. 53 fire trucks were attacked, 8 of them destroyed. 180 ambulances were set on fire in 3 days, along with dozens of banks and mosques. Iranian authorities claim they have evidence, they have data, showing that some of the wounded were finished off and that up to $600 was paid to attack a police station, $1,500 to kill a protester, and $300 to burn official vehicles. A total of 1,300 weapons were seized. And well, they shut down the internet, especially Starlink. In fact, they confiscated, I don't remember how many, but in the video you could see hundreds of Starlink antenna units. And well, they captured documents, transcripts, and so on, and so on, and so on, all related to this. It's undeniable. That's why Iran, after these demonstrations, no longer trusts anyone, just like during the 12-day war. They attacked, and there wasn't a single Iranian plane in the air. All the generals gathered in one place. No. They closed their airspace. It was only for a few hours, but they did it. The planes were in the air. I don't know if they'll take the risk because, well, the F-22s and F-35s can do a lot of damage. But they're ready. This time, I see Iran as prepared, and possibly, as the demonstrations have subsided, the orange agent, Mr. Trump, has also calmed down, because he sees that he can't tear the country apart from within that way. From the outside, it's more difficult, especially after Iran's response in the 12-day war. Netanyahu is keeping a low profile, let's say, right? Why? Because they took a heavy beating in the 12-day war, and he prefers that the one to take the retaliatory blow be the United States, its bases. So he's letting things play out. I even think he spoke with the Iranian Foreign Ministry, telling them it's not their issue, that it's the Americans. It's all the same, since it makes no difference, right?
That's precisely the point where, when they can't break the internal front, and their own ally, Saudi Arabia, asks them not to intervene, and as you said, Israel doesn't dare to intervene alone, the dangerous moment arises. In other words, in Washington, they're actually discussing the possibility of carrying out targeted attacks with tactical nuclear weapons.
Those are strong words. What would China and Russia say, Eduardo?
That's what we're talking about. Exactly. That's the situation. I mean, I was reading the transcript of Pepe Escobar's latest stream. What Pepe Escobar quotes is that in Washington, and he usually has very good inside information since he also worked there professionally years ago, they're openly discussing the possibility of a Samson moment. In other words, if I have to fall, I'll bring everything down with me.
Si tengo que caer, caigo yo con todo el temblor.
Sobre eso, la próxima pregunta para ambos.
On that note, the next question is for both of you. In the meantime, I present a breaking news update from the New York Times, Trump and live updates from the Trump administration. Israel and Arab countries urge Trump to postpone the attack. The matter of the Arab countries had already been reported yesterday, both regarding the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But apparently, according to this version, and here I present it, Israeli leader Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has asked President Trump to delay any attack on Iran, according to a senior US official on Thursday. The Arab countries in the region had already urged Trump not to attack Iran, an idea he has been considering since the beginning of the month, while the government was cracking down on protests sweeping the country. Israeli and Arab officials fear that Iran might retaliate by attacking their citizens. And here's the full column. The Israeli Prime Minister asked Trump to postpone any attack, although they don't explain the reasons. They present absolutely nothing. But even so, this version from the Israelis themselves is interesting, since until very recently, they kept insisting on the need for a second attack. Remember Netanyahu's visit to the United States at the end of the year. He joined Trump in the celebrations. Well, apparently now they don't want an imminent attack, but rather for Trump to delay it. Beyond this version, my question is the following.
Más allá de esta versión, mi pregunta es la siguiente. En el caso de un ataque de Estados Unidos y una respuesta de Irán.
In the event of a US attack and an Iranian response, logically directed against Israel, if that response matches the intensity of the 12-day war and possibly shows even greater strength, since at that time, Iran did not use its full arsenal, but mostly its older and less powerful missiles, then, if Iran strikes back at Israel and Israel finds itself cornered, could it then launch a nuclear attack in that context or not? I wouldn't venture such a thing. I wouldn't carry out an attack of that nature without prior consultation with the United States, and perhaps even with Russia and China, who would surely reject it. Could Israel respond in that way or not?
¿Podría o no Israel responder de esa forma?
Santiago.
Santiago. Well, let's see. For Israel to use nuclear weapons, it would have to be an extremely dire situation for them. Not because they're good people who don't want to use them out of kindness, because I'm sure that if it were up to the Zionist government, they would have already dropped a few bombs. The thing is, in a nuclear exchange, Israel is a very weak country because it's so small. With 3 nuclear bombs, you could destroy the country. Iran, on the other hand, is huge, vast. You do a lot of damage, but you wouldn't kill all Iranians in a nuclear attack. I find it hard to believe they'd respond with nuclear weapons unless they felt they were at risk of disappearing as a state, that the attack was extremely severe. What happens is that also in the eyes of international opinion, if Iran responds with conventional weapons and you respond with a nuclear weapon, well, if Israel is already under heavy criticism right now, it has never been as questioned as it has been after what happened in Gaza, then that would possibly be a nail in its coffin. I think the Israelis know that. Also, Russia or China, after a nuclear attack on Iran, even if it were only a tactical one, might consider giving it the means to defend itself or even to maintain a status quo, providing tactical nuclear weapons or the necessary assistance to develop them. Let's not forget that Iran already has the delivery systems. People always think the nuclear bomb is the hardest part, but it's not. A nuclear bomb, almost any country can make one.
Una bomba nuclear, casi cualquier país puede hacer una bomba nuclear. Si tienes centrales nucleares y técnicos.
If you have nuclear power plants and technicians, it's not something too unusual. The hard part is how you deliver that nuclear bomb. You're not going to throw it by hand. You need launch vectors. Only the major powers have aircraft with the strategic capability to drop those bombs. The launch vectors, which are the missiles, are extremely difficult to develop. That's why Iran has spent years holding on and developing quietly, enduring blows and making progress, because it knows that the most important thing is to have that massive missile capability it now possesses. At this point, it's just a matter of making the bomb and simply putting it on a missile. It has plenty of vectors to launch it. The major powers also have their navies, submarines, ships. I truly hope there's never a nuclear escalation.
Yo espero que no haya nunca una escalada nuclear, indudablemente. Ahora, yo creo que si Irán es atacada, no sé si atacaría.
Now, I think that if Iran is attacked, I don't know if it would strike Israel. It would depend on the type of attack. Of course, if Israel coordinates or takes part in the attack, then it would strike Israel. If not, it would target U.S. bases. Iran doesn't like to attack the U.S. base in Qatar, which is the largest in the region, because Qatar is one of the few Arab countries that has a, let's say, friendly relationship with Iran. And it doesn't like the idea of attacking Qatari territory. But undoubtedly, U.S. bases in the region would be attacked. And if it attacks Israel, I think that if it does, it would be a massive attack. It wouldn't be like the 12-day war. It would be an all-out attack, because it would somehow have to eliminate that threat. Iran can't live under the constant threat of, I'll attack you today, I'll attack you tomorrow, because a country can't develop that way. So, if there's an attack, I think it would be practically a total war.
I believe that behind this Israeli pullback, there are, yes, military considerations, obviously, as Santiago says, and I think they're important. Moreover, we forgot to mention when we were talking about the so-called protests inside Iran, that the ones who detected the Starlink terminals were radar planes provided by Russia. In other words, that demonstrated to the United States and its allies in the region that the Russian-Iranian coalition can blind the use of the most sophisticated Western weapons. That's one element. But I think that fundamentally, the cause must be sought internally, within Israel itself. That is, the situation Netanyahu is facing is very dangerous. On one hand, he's had the good fortune, in heavy quotation marks, that in a car accident, one of the judges trying him was run over, and the driver fled without anyone finding him. These things happen.
I think the insurance company I had was the Mossad's, I believe.
In fact, I think there are times when Mr. Ben-Gvir's police aren't as perfect as they seem. That's on one hand. But on the other, the situation within the coalition and the judicial situation are very heated. I think that fundamentally, we have to look for the cause of yesterday's pullback in Washington. And it has a name, the Federal Reserve. That's where the main fight is. And that's the fight pitting Donald Trump against the international financial oligarchy, particularly the City of London. Let's not forget that his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has his main residence in London, is a personal friend of the British royal couple, and also works for Alex Soros. So, if you agree, let's move on, because this takes us directly to the topic of Greenland.
Now, Eduardo, what's your perspective on the possibility of a Samson option in Israel? Something completely unthinkable. That Israel might do it, that Israel might actually do it. That, in the event of a US and Israeli attack on Iran, Iran would respond even more harshly than in the 12-day war. Could Israel, cornered in such a situation, go so far as to carry out a nuclear attack on Iran?
Acometer un ataque con sus armas nucleares contra Irán? O no?
For that, Ezekiel, history teaches us that the Zionist state is too British to do such things. It learned that, as we say, a bad weed never dies. In other words, one must bring about the destruction of others and never be destroyed oneself. What they would do in that case is provoke a world war, but they would hide their hand. Israel doesn't commit suicide.
A world war, not through a Samson option, but in another way. In your opinion, they would bring it about differently.
They would drag all of Europe and the United States into a world war, but they wouldn't commit suicide. I agree with Eduardo because also, no, they're too British. They know how to play divide and rule too well to risk their own skin in a terminal situation. Israel is a country that acts very tough with the weak. With others, you can negotiate. There's always a way to talk. Just look at its relationship with Russia.
Fíjate la relación que tiene con Rusia. Es decir, no es amigo de Rusia, pero con Rusia está en un estado.
He's not a friend of Russia, but he maintains an ongoing dialogue with Russia, both because of the regional situation and because of the million Jews living in Russia, the minority of Russian origin in Israel, and the holy sites in Jerusalem that are sponsored by the Russian Orthodox Church. It's been that way since the 19th century. The general sponsorship of all Christian denominations in the Holy Land is handled by the Russian Orthodox Church. In other words, there are many ties that connect Israel and Russia, and despite their divergent interests throughout the region, Israel respects them.
En toda la región, Israel los respeta.
Bien.
All right. Well, you agree, Santiago, right?
Es que además, lo que decía antes, es que Israel es un país tan pequeño.
Yes. And also, as I was saying before, Israel is such a small country that you could even destroy it without nuclear weapons. But in a direct confrontation with a power of that size, like Iran, or even Russia or China, the Israelis aren't stupid. They're bastards, no doubt about that, but they're not stupid. So they know that with a country of that potential, it's just that it's a very small country. If you destroy 2 Israeli cities, you've wiped out the country. They don't have much defense. They have more power over the weak, as Eduardo says, of course, over the unarmed.
Bien, incluso podría un país como Irán.
Well, even a country like Iran, by carrying out an attack on the Dimona nuclear plant in Israel, could bring about the destruction of Israel, even without possessing nuclear weapons, right? I would also point out the ideological transformation of the ruling classes in Israel, including, of course, Netanyahu, but with an increasingly significant faction of messianic and supremacist extremists, who might not deliberate strategically as lucidly as you are suggesting, or as Israeli geostrategists used to deliberate not so long ago. Now they're starting wars here and there, one after another, all at once. But anyway, okay.
Una tras otra a la vez, pero bueno, okay.
Allow me to correct you. Israel is a country where without the army's acquiescence, nothing can be done.
All right.
And that's been the case for many years. It's not that the army runs the country, the army allows it to be run. But if the army vetoes something, nothing gets done in Israel.
And the army wouldn't do something crazy like that. No, that's the point, right?
Crystal clear. They're serious officers. Criminals, but serious ones.
¿Qué tal si presentamos
How about we present the second scenario for this talk then? Venezuela. Here are Trump's words from yesterday, if the platform could help me.
El día de ayer, si me ayuda la plataforma, por aquí.
A great conversation today.
Over here, okay, here on their part, I can pause.
Aquí por su parte, puedo aquí pausa. Esta la publicación de Delcy Rodríguez.
This is Delcy Rodriguez's post on Twitter, on X. This is the post shown in the video. Just in case, I'm going to show the original X post directly, in case there was any change or error in the copy of this message. Here's the original. Here I had a long and courteous phone conversation with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, held in a framework of mutual respect, in which we discussed a bilateral work agenda for the benefit of our peoples, as well as pending issues between our governments. This is the current situation, but I would like you, please, not only to provide an analysis of this rapprochement and negotiation between the parties, but also in some way a retrospective analysis of what has happened so far in Venezuela since the attack on December 3rd onward. Whoever wants to start, welcome. Santiago or Eduardo?
Santiago o Eduardo.
¿Podés, por favor, volver a poner el texto porque quiero comenzar?
Could you please put the text back up? Because I want to start from there with pleasure. Here's the text, Eduardo. Perfect. In this text, I want to highlight 3 passages, developed within a framework of mutual respect. That, in the language of international diplomacy, means, as the Mexicans would say, we've insulted each other to the core, but respectfully. In other words, that indicates there was no agreement. Number 2, we addressed a bilateral work agenda. It's not we agreed, it's we worked on the agenda. Here they don't say they reached an agreement on anything. And finally, pending issues. What is the pending issue between Venezuela and the United States? Return the kidnapped president. With this, I'm giving a current overview of the situation in Venezuela. That is, in Venezuela, the institutions of the Bolivarian state have remained. It has maintained control of the territory. It has maintained control of all the institutions. There is national unity, as demonstrated by the unanimous vote of the Bolivarian National Assembly of, wait a moment, today is Thursday, weekend, I think it was last Friday, demanding the return of President Maduro. The opposition as well, and there's only a small group from the external opposition, Maria Corina Machado and Mr. Gonzalez, who applaud the U.S. intervention. And they applaud it reluctantly because Trump has already said he's not going to hand power over to Maria Corina Machado. There are polls that can be debated because I don't know under what conditions they were conducted. A Bloomberg poll shows majority support for the intervention. I don't know how Bloomberg did it. It seems a bit difficult and a bit strange to me.
Possibly Miami conducted the survey.
That's the real situation. I don't mean by this, and I'm saying it very carefully, that the majority of the Venezuelan population supports Nicolás Maduro's government. Because I know for a fact, and I'm aware that there's deep criticism even among active members of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela regarding the government's performance. That is, there are criticisms about corruption, inefficiency, serious economic mistakes, excessive bureaucracy, nepotism. All those kinds of criticisms exist. The situation as of today, and I say as of today because I'm very cautious and have little inside information, is one of control over Venezuelan territory and all of Donald Trump's bluster. We're running Venezuela, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. No. The statement from PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, announcing the resumption of oil shipments, says under current legislation. In other words, it means that at least Chevron, which until now had been operating under the legislation of the Bolivarian state, continues to operate under that same legislation. The United States says that these oil shipments now being sent to refineries in Texas and Louisiana will go to that trust fund Donald Trump mentioned. I haven't seen any official statement about that. So everything should be taken very cautiously. Obviously. If they enter your country with a special force and kidnap your president, they've given you a hard slap in the face. And they killed 32 Cuban heroes who defended themselves for 2.5 hours like lions, and who, as far as is known, inflicted many casualties on the U.S. Special Forces. At least the reports coming from Puerto Rico say that many wounded and many bodies are being evacuated to Texas. In other words, it was a very strong blow, but they neither managed to bring down the Bolivarian government, nor to throw the country into disorder and chaos, nor to carry out a military coup. That is to say, control over the country today remains in the hands of the same forces that held it at the end of last December. And I think Trump is taking that into account. That's why he now says she's a magnificent woman. Yes, well, he dotted the I's and crossed the T's.
Bien, interesante tu análisis, Santiago.
Well, your analysis is interesting. Santiago, what's your view of what happened? But also, what's your view of what happened in terms of what the US government, the Trump administration, wanted with this action? To what extent was it able to achieve those goals or not? And finally, where do we stand now with these so-called negotiations?
Look,
I think the goal of the United States was to intimidate Venezuela. No doubt about it. People here talk a lot about betrayal, about how they handed over Maduro or let themselves be conquered, that Venezuelans didn't defend themselves. But let's put things in perspective. Venezuela is alone, completely alone, facing a country that's a military superpower and has it right on its doorstep. The United States doesn't even need to get close to Venezuela to attack it with its planes or missiles. It's alone because even though Russia and even Iran and China offer their help, that help is very limited. As long as they could, they sent them weapons, I suppose maybe some instructors, but they can't do much more. China or Russia aren't going to send fleets to Venezuela. For what? To confront the United States directly? That's not the game. They can't get into that game. As I said before, Russia already has enough on its plate. And China, well, always keeps that technical distance, right? Like, yes, I'm in favor, but this is as far as I go, right? At least for now. They haven't gone further. So it's very easy to judge the Venezuelan government. They gave away the country. They're handing over the oil. You have to see that right now Venezuela is surrounded. Any ship sailing through the Caribbean that does business with Venezuela or that has done business with Iran is captured by the United States. Today they captured yet another ship. So then, if the Venezuelan economy was already wrecked because it had to sell oil at a low price and in a very limited way, and on top of that, you can't even get a single ship out of the country, what income does Venezuela have? What are you going to allow? For them to destroy Caracas? For you not to be able to export your country's oil? It would be practically a destruction, not instant, surely, because the Americans wouldn't put boots on the ground, except in an operation like the one they carried out. But of course, you're facing the fact that a country as powerful as the United States is constantly crushing you, blocking you. I mean, it would completely destroy the country. His job is indeed very tough because he has to manage to maintain the independence that still exists because, as Eduardo says, there's no American governing Venezuela, and there are no U.S. troops in Venezuela. Therefore, for now, the ones governing Venezuela are Venezuelans. But of course, they're governing. And Delcy talks with Trump because they need to talk to him. They have to reach some kind of agreement, but they need to resolve this situation.
Are they with you, Santiago? Sorry, are the images released a few hours ago by the Southern Command of the boarding of an oil tanker today with you? I can't remember if it's the 6th or the 7th.
Yes, in that sense, yes, that's true.
This is the image. These are the images that were released just a few hours ago, right? Sorry for the interruption, Santiago.
Yes, that's what I was saying earlier. They're seizing oil tankers, even ones flying the Russian flag, because I think this one had also switched to the Russian flag, and it seems they don't care much about that. Russia isn't showing much aggression toward the United States either. It could be seizing American ships, but it's not doing so. They're walking a very fine line. I think that's part of the negotiation. It's something global, right? In reality, when negotiations happen, they're not just about Venezuela or Ukraine or Iran. Right now, especially for Russia, it's a whole package. It has to make sure it doesn't lose focus on the Ukraine negotiations, help its allies, and maintain its image among the BRICS countries as a protective power, so to speak, right? The country that dominates the economy within the BRICS is China, and the one that leads in military protection is Russia. So it has to maintain that position. But right now, I wanted to make a comment because it just... Go ahead, they just published something. Delcy made a statement in Parliament and said that if Venezuela ever had to send me as acting president to Washington, I would go standing, walking, not dragged. I would go with the tricolor flag, with the national anthem, marking the rhythm of my heart. She also said that all of Venezuela is under threat, and that's why she called for unity, for national union. so that with sovereignty at the forefront, we can fight the diplomatic battle.
Demos la batalla diplomática. Con eso sí que tienen la ayuda de Rusia y de China.
In that regard, they do have the support of Russia and China, which is very valuable. Venezuela doesn't carry much weight, either at the UN or in major international forums. But if Russia and China back it, things change. Because they can block sanctions, they can do a lot. And well, right now, Venezuela is in a very tough spot. It's going to have to learn to navigate carefully, as the saying goes. Try to keep control of its country and its sovereignty, but it will have to negotiate with the United States, because otherwise, they'll box it in.
Bien, eso sin dudas. Ahora.
Well, that's for sure. Now, the United States must also establish negotiations with Venezuela. Both sides seem forced to negotiate, and, so far, Venezuela appeared willing, while the United States did not. That's why hypotheses still abound about Trump's objective in this intervention, and I wanted to present two hypotheses, not necessarily contradictory, and ask for your opinions on them. The first is the hypothesis put forward by Pepe Escobar about the main reason for the attack on Venezuela. For Escobar, what we're witnessing here is an attack by the United States against China, but above all, against China in defense of the dollar.
Pero por sobre todas las cosas contra China en defensa del dólar, ¿sí? Debido a que Venezuela realiza la exportación.
Since Venezuela exports its oil, since the beginning of the sanctions, mostly to China, with 80% of Venezuelan oil being sold to China, and in yuan or currencies other than the dollar, according to Pepe Escobar, the United States cannot accept this, especially not in the Americas. And according to Escobar himself, this is also one of the reasons behind the potential attack on Iran. So the dollar and China issue on one hand, for your opinion, and on the other hand, another hypothesis that's been heard around, perhaps bolder, riskier, but also interesting. Eduardo just a moment ago recalled Maduro's presidential guard, Cubans who died defending Maduro. And that's where the version appeared, that, in reality, the United States, with this operation, wanted, in addition to capturing Maduro, to seize the La Carlota military airport in Caracas, in order to begin a much faster and larger airborne troop landing. Which would make sense, considering the enormous amount of military resources concentrated in the Caribbean, only to then carry out an operation involving just a few soldiers, so to speak. According to this hypothesis, the Venezuelan response would have thwarted this attempt to capture the La Carlota military airport. And that's why Trump later adjusted the narrative from, we want an attack, a landing in Venezuela, or a much stronger strike and the fall of the regime, to no, we only wanted to capture Maduro, put him on trial, and now we're beginning negotiations with the authorities currently in power there. That's the second hypothesis. I'd like to hear both of your opinions on this before we move on to the third topic, Greenland.
Regarding the second hypothesis, it seems absolutely plausible to me. That is, that the operation failed because certain elements were not clarified on the tactical military level. The objective was only to kidnap Maduro. Why attacks in Mérida in the Andes? Why attacks in different parts of the country? I mean, it was precisely in Mérida where the civilian casualties occurred. Clearly, the attack had other objectives besides the kidnapping of the president. And what you said is possible. I can imagine the attack in Mérida, if one knows the geography of the Venezuelan power grid, as something that makes sense.
The
Venezuelan power grid, a legacy of old North American domination, doesn't really exist as a network. It's a single route that starts from the Orinoco River, from Ciudad Bolívar, from the dam on the Orinoco, and in a semicircle moves from the Orinoco toward the Caribbean coast, toward the northeastern Caribbean coast, and then runs along the entire Caribbean coast, where the main urban centers are located, continuing along the Andes axis until it reaches Maracaibo. That's why, during the period of sabotage against the Venezuelan power grid, it was very easy to cut it at a single point and leave all of Venezuela without electricity, because it doesn't exist as a network, it's just one route.
Es una sola ruta.
So, by attacking Mérida, the major oil fields in Zulia State, in the Gulf of Maracaibo, are left without electricity, as well as the entire city of Maracaibo, which is the country's second largest city. That's where I would see the coherence, the plausibility of the hypothesis you just mentioned. As for the dollar issue, yes, without a doubt. That is, at the beginning of the program, we said that the attack on Venezuela was complementary to the strategy aimed at attacking Iran. Why? Because the idea was that if a war broke out in West Asia, Iran would block the Persian Gulf and the oil supply from that region would be interrupted.
Y se iba a bloquear el suministro de petróleo del Golfo Pérsico. Por lo tanto,
therefore, by taking control of Venezuela's oil production, the United States, although not immediately, since it requires reconstruction, many years of technical work and major investments to become operational, would have secured an alternative source of a different type of oil, heavy crude. But at least heavy crude is useful for producing fuel oil, which is the fuel mainly used in the United States for road and river transport. Let's remember that the main Achilles heel of the U.S. economy is that it abandoned the development of railroads many decades ago. And the United States depends almost entirely on road transport and river transport along the Missouri and the Mississippi. And for that, it needs heavy oil. That's why it depends on Venezuela. So that's one side of it. It's all part of a whole. It's all interconnected. Yes, indeed, there's the need to push China out of its spheres of influence by reestablishing the dollar. We know the story. I think we've explained it many times in our programs. Since 1971, when the United States detached the dollar from the gold standard, the dollar began to float and was left without backing.
Queda sin respaldo.
Starting in 1973, when the Yom Kippur War broke out between the Arab countries and Israel, and the oil embargo took place, with the massive increase in oil prices, the Arab monarchies of Western Asia began investing their windfall profits in the British and American financial systems. And that is what gave backing to the dollar. That's why in 1974, the United States made an agreement with Saudi Arabia for oil to be traded exclusively in dollars. That is what gave the United States the support to keep issuing paper indefinitely, as it has done for the past 5 decades, financing its wars and its technological development in the 1980s. In other words, all its military ventures around the world have been financed with paper.
Todas sus aventuras militares en el mundo están financiadas con papel. Y ese papel tiene un respaldo, que es el petrodólar.
And that paper has backing, which is the petrodollar. That's why the United States cannot allow countries to abandon the dollar in international trade. In other words, it's the mortal sin. The problem is that many are doing it precisely because of the United States' own arrogance. Since the U.S. does not provide guarantees of political security, the shift toward other currencies, not a total shift, but operating with different currencies, gives many countries in the global south economic security. That's the case of India, negotiating Russian oil in rubles and rupees. It's the case of Indonesia. In other words, there are very important countries, very important economies in the global south that are operating with a basket of currencies in order to have predictability in a time of great turbulence.
Bien.
And your analysis is very interesting, Eduardo Vior. Your perspective on these issues.
Bueno, la última explicación de Eduardo sobre el dólar.
Well, regarding Eduardo's latest view and explanation about the dollar, I don't have much more to add. In recent years, even if not in large amounts, the number of countries using other funds, other currencies besides the dollar, has been steadily increasing. And of course, that's a problem for the United States. It can't export its inflation to the rest of the world. Moreover, today it was reported that the United States is printing money out of thin air. The pace set is the second most aggressive in history. The M2 money supply increased by about 1.7 trillion, with a B as in Europe, not the US dollars last year, reaching a record $27 trillion. It's the fastest growth since the start of the COVID pandemic. Remember that during COVID, Donald Trump devoted himself to handing out money, printing, and giving aid. So undoubtedly, a question, Santiago, out of ignorance.
Una pregunta, Santiago, de ignorancia. M2 no es, no son los...
Isn't M2 bank deposits? Honestly, I'm not sure. M1 is cash. I think M2 refers to demand deposits. That is, it's not physical money, but it should be counted as such. So, what we're really talking about is an expansion of bank holdings.
De las tenencias bancarias.
Yes, it says that. Yes, but remember that in the United States, the money supply is generated by the Federal Reserve based on previous loans. So basically, they create those loans for the money issuance given to the Reserve, and then for the money issuance, right? That's why both issues are more or less connected.
Por eso, más o menos vinculadas ambas cuestiones.
Bueno, pues eso para proteger el dólar. Después también
Well, that's it, to protect the dollar. Then he also tries to push China out, and if possible, Russia too, from Venezuela. He wants Venezuela for himself. As Eduardo mentioned, if you want to attack Iran, you risk it blocking oil traffic and prices going up, leaving you without reserves. So the first thing they wanted to do was secure a more or less reliable source of oil. I'll take control of Venezuela's oil. If I can't have it, I won't let anyone else have it. That's why he blockaded Venezuela with the fleet, so ships couldn't leave, and he secured that supply. So yes, I think that was one of the most important points, no doubt about it.
De los puntos más importantes, indudablemente. En cuanto al apartado militar,
As for the military aspect, when operations of this kind are carried out, they usually have objectives A, B, and C, which are achieved as the action unfolds. Possibly, kidnapping Maduro would have been Plan A, undoubtedly. Now, I think as Eduardo says that they might have tried to capture the airport to have a greater troop presence, although, on the other hand, I find it strange because if they capture the airport, then how do you hold it? Because those troops need logistical support and so on. It's like an island there in the middle of Caracas. It's not easy, right? If they did it, taking the airport would mean they were sure Venezuela wouldn't respond. I think that by capturing Maduro, what they expected was for the Chavista Bolivarian government to dissolve. If the Bolivarian government were to dissolve as the hours went by, then yes, taking the airport could have an effect, because the troops, the army, could be left decapitated, and so on. Everything, as each step is carried out, can move forward. The attacks deep inside Venezuela, as Eduardo said, yes, one is meant to hit the energy infrastructure and cause damage, but also, when an attack of this scale is carried out, they try to strike many different points. They have the capability, because they have many weapons, to attack many different targets in Venezuela, even if that particular target isn't of interest to the United States at that moment. But it still forces the air defenses, the Air Force, and so on, to spread out. Moreover, it creates chaos throughout the country, because wars are also won in the mind. And if all the major cities of Venezuela, or a large part of the territory, feel attacked, assaulted, in other words, invaded, then it becomes a stronger psychological weapon to try to overthrow the government. What happened? The government held on. Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of Defense, now I can't recall his name, Vladimir Padrino, yes, Vladimir Padrino, Delcy Rodriguez, they all stayed in their positions, kept giving orders to the country, keeping it together. And perhaps the operation was cut short precisely because of that, because they saw there was no chance of going any further. And well, the prize they had, of course, was enough to present it as a victory, not a failure of the attack. No, it's a victory. We kidnapped, no, we captured. They don't kidnap, they capture Maduro. Something illegal, undoubtedly.
La última para los dos.
The last one, for both of you, about the third most important scenario in question. Here Greenland, here are images of... Sorry, before this one I want to show this other image. The arrival of Lars Løkke, Denmark's Minister of Foreign Affairs, in Washington, at the White House, for a meeting with US authorities. He was accompanied by this lady, a representative of Greenland. And upon leaving, there was an improvised, quite candid press conference by this gentleman.
Because it is not
Attention.
In Greenland for a decade or
Clarito, ¿no?
And clearly, no Russian ships or anything like that in the Arctic, in Greenland. Upon leaving, by the way, he also described the meeting as a failure, because according to this gentleman, the United States did not give up its desire to seize Greenland. Third participation of Lars Løkke in the US debate.
Here. Don't you think they're going to vote? Yes. I'll be right back. Excuse me.
All right, go ahead.
Go on. I'll be right back.
Perfect. Let's present this. Here's Lars Løkke, yesterday on Fox.
I mean, you don't think they're going to vote?
Don't you think they'll vote to break it up?
Not at all.
No, not even. Because I think there's no way the United States would pay for the Scandinavian goods system in Greenland. Honestly. They haven't introduced that Scandinavian goods system.
But you also don't believe the U.S. is going to...
But you don't think the United States is going to invade Greenland either, do you?
At least I do.
No, at least I don't expect that, because it would mean the end of NATO.
El fin de la OTAN.
The end of NATO. These were yesterday's statements from the Danish foreign minister. And Trump, without hesitation, replied as follows. It's in English, but...
Pero... aún así,
right now it
podemos
sounds
presentar.
like you were saying
The president would seize Greenland by force, Trump replies.
Entraría Groenlandia por la fuerza y responde Trump. ¿Quién está
Who's saying that?
diciendo
Did you say it? No, I didn't. You, reporter, must be the one saying it.
Debe estar diciéndolo y de vuelta en esto.
You don't know what I'm going to do.
so what are the
He doesn't know what I'm going to do, replies Trump.
President, are you willing to leave the NATO?
El ministro de
The Minister of Foreign Affairs, after the meeting with Rubio, said that substantial differences still remain.
Diferencias sustanciales. ¿Estaría usted dispuesto a una intervención directa?
Would you be willing to consider direct intervention?
I'm not going to give up options, but it's very important. Greenland's very important.
No le voy a decir
I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do, but I can't rule anything out either.
ninguna opción. Groenlandia
Greenland is very important.
And the problem is, there's not a thing that Denmark can do about it if Russia...
And this is very important for the security of the United States, for the security of the entire Western Hemisphere. And the thing is, there's nothing Denmark can do against our will to take Greenland. But we, on the other hand, can do whatever we want, as you surely noticed we did in Venezuela.
como seguramente se habrá dado cuenta que hicimos en Venezuela.
We can do about things such as...
Nosotros podemos hacer muchas cosas mientras que ellos no pueden hacer
We can do
nada.
many things while they can't do anything about it.
I can't rely on Denmark being able to defend themselves.
I can't trust Greenland to defend itself and to defend the Arctic.
Defendiendo el Ártico.
About they put an extra dog, and they were serious about this. They put an extra...
Y los dinamarqueses ahora están hablando sobre aumentar.
And now the Danes are talking about increasing Greenland's security by sending another dog sled. They're adding a second dog sled for Greenland's defense. Well, Trump's old mocking jab at Denmark. They can't do anything, and we can do everything. Even if they add a second dog sled, it's completely irrelevant.
Esto completamente intrascendente. Y aquí, por cierto, las imágenes del día de hoy.
And here, by the way, are today's images. The arrival of Danish soldiers in Greenland. My respects to the editors at Deutsche Welle for how they presented this, because they really showed footage of 4 soldiers descending with suspenseful music, as if it were the Normandy landing, more or less. 4 soldiers, literally. Big guys, no doubt. The Danes are big. But this is Denmark's troop deployment, and along with these 4 soldiers came a contingent of military advisors from 5 countries: Germany, France, Norway, Sweden, and later, information from the United Kingdom as well, invited by Greenland. Now then, this seemingly vigorous European response amounted to 13 German soldiers, 13 French, 2 Finnish, 2 Norwegian, and 1 from the United Kingdom. It's the deployment of European troops for defense against a possible US invasion. Well, perspectives on the overall situation in Greenland. Santiago, would you like to start now? Go ahead.
Adelante.
Vamos a ver.
Let's see. There's a song that says, Macara de ceñido pantalón. Well, he doesn't wear tight pants, but he's a real thug, no doubt about it. As you say, he trolls journalists, he trolls the general public all over the world, because one day he attacks, the next day he forgives. One day he's a drug trafficker, the next he's a very good person and says he loves Venezuelans very much because he's in love with them, with their leaders, and with everyone. And the truth is, he's laughing at Europe. He's laughing at Europe because, first of all, he managed to get Europe, which was never militarily strong, because yes, NATO is a very powerful system, but we have to remember that armies work much better when they belong to a single country with one language, one training system, one set of tactics, rather than when you bring together a bunch of different countries. A bit like a Tower of Babel. And on top of that, he managed to get Europe to disarm itself. Europe right now, even if it wanted to confront the United States and send troops and everything, is unarmed. All its weapon reserves were spent in Ukraine. We barely have any air defenses, practically nothing. Besides, I don't see Europe having enough character to directly confront the United States if it wanted to take Greenland. It's true that NATO would have to dissolve, because if one of its members invades another member, then it obviously stops making sense. Who's the United States defending you from if it's the one invading you, right? It's ridiculous. So, well, yes, NATO would be destroyed. It seems that lately the United States doesn't really care much if NATO is destroyed in this sense, right? I mean, if they can keep it going and it doesn't cost too much, then fine. It's a way to have control over Europe and keep dominating it, right? But it seems that given the kind of policy Trump wants to pursue, he wouldn't care much if NATO disappeared or lost its purpose either, because I don't think they'd shut it down overnight. But of course, it doesn't make much sense. Honestly, it's a risky bet for the United States on the international stage, but well, after all the statements and everything they've been doing, like capturing presidents and so on, it seems they don't really care much. I think Trump wants to reach the U.S. congressional elections with a great victory, like the Roman generals when they arrived in Rome after conquering Gaul, or the Germanic barbarians. They presented their candidacy to become emperor thanks to having expanded the empire. Trump might be aiming for something like that in the elections. We also have to see under what authorization he would invade Greenland. Is the U.S. Congress going to accept it? Because we're talking about invading a country. It's undeniably a formal declaration of war. The President of the United States can't do that. Congress has to. How would he present it as a limited operation? What's he going to do? The SEAL cartel in Greenland? Because that's the only way, right, that we're attacking the Greenlandic narco SEALs. Because if you attack a country directly without a reason, simply for territorial expansion, Congress has to approve it. I don't know how you see it, Eduardo.
I think that, well, this topic has many facets. First of all, we have to take into account the current geostrategic importance of the island of Greenland. the largest island in the world. It's located just south of the North Pole, with coasts on the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean facing Canada. But to the north lies the Arctic route, which is slowly becoming active thanks to global warming. Russia is making great progress in developing the Arctic route as an alternative channel for communication between Asia and Europe, and China wants to join in. Some Chinese companies began making shipments during the last northern summer. The Russians are very advanced, to the point that they have submarine expeditions in the North Pole. There's a whole wealth of minerals in that region. And the United States is very, very far behind in that competition because it hasn't developed its icebreaker fleet. So Greenland obviously has a huge advantage there. On one hand, on the eastern side, it controls the passage of the Russians toward Europe, and on the other, it controls the American Arctic route, that is, along the northern coast of Alaska and the northern coast of Canada. We already know that, in addition, Trump said that Canada should become the 51st state of the Union. That's one thing, besides the island's own wealth. Sparsely populated, it has fewer than 60,000 inhabitants. Most are Inuit who do not exercise government authority. That is, the Greenlandic government, an autonomous government within the community of the Kingdom of Denmark, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. In other words, there's a whole special situation that gives Greenland its importance. On the other hand, Denmark and the Scandinavian countries are part of the Rapid Deployment Force led by Great Britain, founded in 2018 as a practically self-coordinated force within NATO. It is essentially Britain's allied arm within NATO, allowing it to deploy throughout Northern Europe. There are 10 countries involved. If the United States affects one of the countries in that community, it is directly affecting the United Kingdom. That's why I was surprised just now when Ezekiel mentioned that there was a member of the British Armed Forces. Why? Well, that person was a supervisor.
Top knot.
He went as a supervisor to see what the others were doing. He says, because if the French and the Germans go, he wasn't going to leave them alone. Obviously. But this is a direct conflict between the White House and the City of London. That is, what Trump wants to show the City of London, and therefore the British Crown, is that he's the one who controls the paths of the global economy, which is the same fight he's having internally. It's one and the same. I already mentioned a while ago that his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is a friend of the British royal couple and has his main residence in London.
Y tiene su domicilio principal en Londres. Y Scott Bessent es el hombre.
And Scott Bessent is the man who is now defending Jeremy Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, whom Trump wants to oust. This fight boils down to the one over Greenland. It is, as we say in Buenos Aires, in the neighborhood, a slap in the face to the British Crown, a way of saying, I'll show you that I can do it in your own house. Just as he forced Ursula von der Leyen last June to go find him at a private golf course in Scotland on British soil to sign Europe's economic surrender.
Trump's property, the golf course.
Yes, his private property, yes. What he wants now is to prove something, to force the Danes to give in to the threat and say, well, yes, honestly, I understand you, let's negotiate, we can't solve this by force, and submit to his will. And in that way, indirectly, what he's really doing is subjugating the British Crown. Now, the return won't come with the 13 European soldiers in Greenland, but through two different paths. On one hand, through the signals already being sent by European allies who are saying that negotiations with Russia are necessary. Friedrich Merz said it yesterday. Meloni already said it last week. Giorgia Meloni. In other words, they're starting to realize the truth of that old Henry Kissinger phrase. Being an enemy of the United States is bad, but being its friend is terrible. It's the bear hug. Being a friend of the United States leaves you gasping for air. You cease to exist. So they're timidly trying to see if they dare to find a bit of their own path, a bit of oxygen, some political space of their own. On the other hand, there's going to be an economic response within the country, within the United States. The banks are going to react somehow. They're going to send a warning signal. There's an underlying issue in all of this that we don't mention when we talk about Venezuela. Trump is deeply angry because when he gathered the presidents of the country's main oil companies, the only one who said yes, that they would invest in Venezuela, was the one already doing so, Chevron. The people from Exxon, the Rockefeller family, who had been Trump's historical patrons for decades, told him, not with this legislation. Until we're compensated for Hugo Chávez's nationalizations, we're not coming back. In other words, they left him on his own. And behind that maneuver by the oil companies are the banks, which don't want to lower the interest rate, something he desperately needs to revive the economy before the election campaign.
Bien, más que interesante.
Well, more than interesting. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind everyone once again, for all the demolishers out there, that we've launched a channel on Patreon to stand against censorship. You can see it here on screen, where we share what we can't show on YouTube. Everyone's invited to subscribe. We're already over 1,100 members. These are the topics we've covered so far. The latest one yesterday was this discussion with Fernando. Germany's historical responsibility in the war in Ukraine and in the current situation of Eurasian insecurity. There was also another broadcast about Zionism, based on a remarkable debate between Jeffrey Sachs and Rabin Manuel. Well, 4 experts on Zionism, presenting its origins, its transformations, and the current situation.
Los orígenes del sionismo, sus transformaciones, la situación actual, a eso reaccionamos, y la entrevista a Sergei Karaganov.
That's what we reacted to. And the interview with Sergei Karaganov. Those are our 3 broadcasts so far, and we've already generated more than 1,100. So everyone is invited there, where we present what we can't present here. We couldn't show those topics here because our videos would be taken down immediately. And of course, if this generates a significant flow of followers, we could reactivate the YouTube analysts from DMP there, like Eduardo and Santiago. So, to their followers, please help us by joining us in that project as well. That said, dear Eduardo and Santiago, whatever you'd like for the closing, the mic is open, at your disposal. A bit of promotion for your work, naturally, and also whatever else you'd like.
Yo quería cerrar con una pregunta, ¿no?
I wanted to wrap up with a question, right? Actually, the United States can already deploy troops in Greenland. It has an agreement with Denmark under which it must notify them that it's going to do so. But it can. If it puts a bit of pressure on Denmark, I'm sure that within NATO, to protect themselves from the Chinese threat, the Russian threat, and all that, they would end up agreeing to establish some kind of military base. Even economic agreements with the United States for the exploitation of Greenland's resources, because it wants to secure control on the ground. That's the point, isn't it? If it practically already has it, then we're talking about national security or territorial expansion. That's the point. And then, well, I'd like to invite you to my channel, Santiago Eureka News on YouTube. You already know my Telegram and X channels. And well, from there, let's keep growing. Let's see if we can grow a bit. Censorship is really tough.
A ver si vamos creciendo un poquillo. La censura está muy dura.
Eduardo, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning of the program, long ago and far away. We're on the brink of a nuclear war at any moment. The situation is extremely dangerous. All the legal norms of the previous international order have been broken. There is no international institution capable of regulating or arbitrating current conflicts. We're left to the bare relations between powers and between countries. And since the U.S. government can't get its own ship back on course, nor manage to assert itself, which I keep insisting is to me the most important thing, it can't assert itself over the financial oligarchy so that financial capital serves the reindustrialization of the United States. So, since he hasn't managed to get the machine running, the tariffs have been quite effective in drastically reducing the U.S. trade deficit. They've brought huge revenues to the U.S. Treasury, but at the same time, they've caused inflation in many sectors and disrupted supply chains. The only justification for such a major disruption would be if the industrial machinery started working again. But that industrial machinery needs cheap credit. It's very behind and needs really a lot of credit to get going again, and in a few years even consider the possibility of competing with China once more.
De volver a competir con China. Y ese es el talón de Aquiles de Trump. No tiene el control.
And that's Trump's Achilles heel. He doesn't control the finances. And the finances are managed from London more than from Wall Street. That's the veto power the British monarchy holds. And that's the enormous danger, because Great Britain never considers itself bound by any regulation among the powers. That's where the danger lies. The danger isn't so much in Trump. The danger is that Great Britain, in order to force the United States to remain its ally, might start a major provocation against Russia. I think more against Russia than against China. Forcing the United States to get involved.
Que obligue a los Estados Unidos a implicarse. Y ahí es donde entramos. Corremos riesgo de catástrofe.
And that's where we run the risk of catastrophe. I mean, what am I staging here? For those who know a bit of history, I'm setting the scene for the beginning of World War I, when forced alliances were what turned a small local crisis into a world war. Today, there are no forced alliances, but there are situations that through a chain of events become binding. That is, if Great Britain starts something in West Asia and Israel gets involved, the United States will inevitably be drawn in. And that's where the risks lie, which are very serious right now.
Fascinating. Your closing remarks. Where can followers find you, Eduardo?
At
this moment, until we have YouTube channels again, there are still no possibilities. We'll announce it in due time. That's what we're working on, both with Santiago and, well, I hope this other opportunity with you also works out. It'll be a pleasure if you can follow me again on those platforms. And if not, you can follow me on Telegram under Vior, the same on X, or you can follow the posts on the Tectónicos Architecture in the Modern World portal, where you can also read a huge number of top-level analysts from different countries.
Tectónicos, también súper recomendado. Además, los vamos a
Tectónicos is also highly recommended. Plus, we'll have them participating here. Well, Santiago joins Juan Antonio Aguilar on Mondays, but we'll also be inviting both of them here, just like last week when Javier Martínez and Adrián Zelaya took part. Bruno Scarsini is still pending among the DMP analysts. He hasn't been invited yet, but surely next week or the one after, we'll have a talk with him and others. So you can also follow all of them here. That said, Demolishers, thank you very much for joining us. Tomorrow we'll be back again with Juan Antonio Aguilar, as every Friday. A kiss, a hug, and see you soon. Bye.
Un beso y un abrazo y hasta pronto. Chao.
Todo.
Yeah.